My name is Jesse Kharbanda. I'm the Executive Director of the Hoosier Environmental Council. If you're not familiar with HEC, we are a statewide, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that has been around for 37 years. And we have three major aims. We seek to improve environmental health, protect land and water, and advance a sustainable economy. Our work on factory farming is something that we have done for more than 12 years. And it is what we're going to obviously focus on in this conversation with Kim Ferraro. Before I introduce Kim, I want to express gratitude to Jenny Jenkins, our Senior Special Projects Coordinator, who has done a tremendous amount to make this event possible, a tremendous amount of behind the scenes work. So thank you, Jenny. We welcome your questions, and if you'd like to pose any questions, please put those in the chat. And we know that we live in a polarized political time. We hope that that won't be the case as time progresses, but we know it is a very polarizing time, and we know that the issue of factory farming or confined animal feeding operations is a contentious issue in different rural communities. And we just request that if you pose a question or share a comment, please do so in the spirit of respect, which we hope we certainly seek to extend to all as well. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague and friend, Kim Ferraro, who is the Senior Staff Attorney at the Hoosier Environmental Council. Kim has been in that role for nearly a decade, and Kim has been in that role for nearly a decade, and she has won some landmark cases for HEC and the broader environmental cause. And furthermore, just this year, she has argued before the Indiana Supreme Court. Her abilities and skills, her intelligence and compassion in this realm have gotten the notice of her alma mater, Valparaiso University School of Law, as well as the IU McKinney School of Law, as well as Indiana Lawyer. And we're so glad and grateful to have Kim as such an essential part of the Hoosier Environmental Council. So with that, welcome, Kim.
Hi, Jesse. Hello, everyone. Glad you could watch the film this evening.
Absolutely. Kim, what we want to do initially is to kind of have a brief conversation between the two of us, really to localize this very powerful film to Indiana, and then definitely we'd like to field questions for Kim from the audience. So I'll start off, Kim, by talking about really the obvious here, which is that the film is a series of powerful stories from Wisconsin and Iowa, North Carolina, Arizona, talking about how communities have been so impacted by factory farm pollution. Can you share some stories of that kind of challenge and plight here in Indiana?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what drew me to this issue in the first place was one of my very first legal cases. I was contacted by a very sweet couple down in Wayne County, Indiana, Eric and Lisa Stickdorn, who are actually small farmers themselves. And they unfortunately found themselves living next to a dairy confined feeding operation that literally drove them from their home of 20 years. The stream that went through their property became so polluted by the dairy waste that they could no longer let their own cattle drink from that stream. They were sent to the emergency room several times, and we litigated their case over the course of a 5-year period. And fortunately, in that case, did win. The Stickdorns were able to return home, but only after, like I said, several years of fighting. Another very disturbing example is 2 retired couples in Hendricks County that back in 2015 found themselves and their community of more than 60 homes to be the new neighbors of an 8,000 head hog factory. And I think their story is really important to talk about in understanding what people or what citizens are facing in Indiana and elsewhere. Because this community, like the communities we saw in the film, started with their local government when they heard about this factory farm coming in. They attended plan commission meetings and zoning meetings and voiced their concerns. They ultimately didn't prevail there, primarily because the zoning ordinance provided no protections for them. The state of Indiana's regulations of confined feeding operations afforded no protection, so the CAFO got its permit. Ultimately, 2 years in, these folks, are suffering from the extreme noxious odors and emissions, air emissions. So we came in, we did bring a legal case on their behalf. We hired a property assessor to assess their their property values, and sure enough, they lost more than half of the property value of their homes that they had lived in for decades. We had air testing conducted that proved that there were noxious, dangerous emissions of ammonia and volatile fatty acids from the CAFO coming onto their property. Even so, even after 5 years of litigation, we have not been able to obtain justice for this family. And the reason is because of the way the laws are written in Indiana, and specifically Indiana's Right to Farm Act, which I know we'll talk about, Jesse. So that's to give you sort of a big picture of two very unfortunate examples. One happy story, but one unhappy story, and the way that this issue impacts real people's lives.
And thanks, Kim, for that and for sharing those two stories. And it's clear from the comments that we're already getting that there's a desire to advocate to achieve more protective laws for people who've been hurting from factory farm pollution.
Mm-hmm.
Speak to, Kim, maybe some of the science here in Indiana. What do we know about the scale of how rural communities are impacted by groundwater contamination or by air pollution? What can we provide to people who are listening in who want to advocate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the data that we have is reason enough for everyone to be concerned about this issue, not just people who live in rural communities. One very stark data point is from our state agency's list of impaired waters that they put together every 4 years, that confirms that pathogens, E. coli, from animal waste, from livestock waste, is the #1 polluter of our waterways. So that affects all of us, not just folks in rural communities. We also know from a Purdue EPA conducted study of air emissions at CAFOs in Indiana that CAFOs are emitting, each one is emitting dangerous air emissions that would otherwise be regulated if they were emitted by any other industry, but under the Clean Air Act. So in other words, at regulatory thresholds, but under the Clean Air Act, they are not regulated. We also know that CAFOs are contaminating roughly 60% of rural residential drinking water wells in communities that have high numbers of CAFOs. And this happens because it's legal. You saw those big waste lagoons that we saw in the film. Those are unlined, so the waste, the contaminants from that waste leach into groundwater. And when they spread that waste on land, it can leach into groundwater as well. It also can run off into nearby surface waters because under the law, we're allowing these massive waste lagoons, these massive animal factories to be located just 300 feet away from a surface water. They also can be located in very sensitive ecological areas where groundwater is very near the surface. So, this is happening, this isn't theoretical, and people are suffering because of it. Oh, you're on mute, Jesse, I think.
Thank you, Kim. One thing that's so noteworthy about this issue in factory farming, whether it's in the US, whether it's in Indiana or elsewhere, is just the scale of the impact. And you really drove that home by talking about how factory farming is the #1 source of water pollution in Indiana. Given that scale, why is that the case? What's the fundamental forces in agriculture that is leading to the scale of pollution from factory farming?
Yeah, it actually started decades ago when there were federal and state policies that were passed to actually protect small farmers, subsidies for crops, during bad years, et cetera, that over time have had the perverse incentive of benefiting large corporations. And so what has happened is we now have literally a handful, 4 to 5 major transnational corporations that control 90% of all the meat, dairy, and poultry products that are produced in the world. And so that is such market consolidation that small farmers, traditional farmers, just simply can't compete. And of course, the more power these corporations have, the more power, the undue influence they're able to exert at all levels of government. And so what we see is that at federal, state, and local levels, just like we saw in the film, big ag, big industrial ag is really getting its way. It's writing the laws that control their very operations.
Kim, we're going to talk now about public policy, which you've been alluding to in some of your answers already. But before we do that, we have a question from Theodore asking about whether there is a publicly accessible list of CAFOs in Indiana.
There is actually, and if you go on our website, hecweb.org, and click on factory farm waste issues, and then scroll to the bottom of that page, you'll find a link of a current list of Indiana's factory farms. We do try to update that periodically. If you have trouble finding it, you can email me at kferraro@hecweb.org.
Great, thanks, Kim. Well, again, to kind of set the policy context for our listeners here, what is the essence of Indiana's right to farm law, and can it provide any protections to longstanding rural residents?
Well, the problem with Indiana's right to farm law is that far from protecting anybody, it strips the property rights of rural residents. So what the right to farm law does, it should be called a right to harm, as aptly pointed out in this movie, is it provides legal immunity to farmers, to agricultural operations, from nuisance lawsuits. So this law was initially enacted back decades ago to address urban sprawl. So people moving from the city out to the country next to an existing farm, not liking the smell, suing the farmer. So it was enacted for a good reason. But over time, and this has happened in Indiana and is happening all over the United States, these right to farm laws have been amended so that it actually strips existing landowners who were there first from being able to sue a CAFO that moves in next to them. And that's exactly what's happened in the Hendricks County case, the Himsel case that I alluded to earlier. We brought that litigation, and because of the Right to Farm Act, they were not, even though they owned their homes literally for decades, Richard Himsel farmers, born on their property, they were deemed under our right to farm law to have moved to the nuisance simply because where the CAFO stood was a cornfield before the CAFO existed. So they no longer have the ability to get any relief in court for the damages, the extreme damages, the 60% loss in property value that they've suffered, the upending of their lives and livelihoods, their plans to retire in peace and dignity have been literally turned upside down. And that's because of the Right to Farm Act.
And that's just one of several laws that govern or touch upon issues of industrial livestock agriculture. Are there laws in Indiana that have to do with regulating air pollution or odor from factory farms?
No, our Indiana's confined feeding law essentially targets how manure is managed at a factory farm. There are literally no regulations, no standards or limits on air emissions and odors, even though we now know that CAFOs emit hazardous pollution, air pollution, that in other industries that pollute those same air emissions are regulated under the Clean Act, but CAFOs are not. So no, that is something that we need to regulate, but it's not regulated in Indiana, nor is it regulated under the Federal Clean Air Act by the EPA.
Astonishing. Lance had a question about going back to the right to farm law. in Indiana about if you happen to know the citation for the law.
Ooh, it's 32-36-30-6. And if I got that wrong, again, email me, I can send it to you.
Thank you, Kim.
Yeah, you'd think I'd know that by heart.
You're very close if you're not spot on. Let's also field some additional questions from our audience, and then I do want to talk to you about some signs of hope here in Indiana, even in spite of the existence of the Indiana Right to Farm law and the absence of any law related to air pollution. As someone who is from the industrial section of the state, Northwest Indiana, I'm trying to educate myself on this issue. This is from Lance. If a CAFO moratorium bill were to be introduced, how much support could it garner in the Indiana General Assembly?
Well, that has been tried in a few communities over the years, where local counties have tried to pass moratoriums, and those were eventually defeated in litigation by the industry as being unconstitutional. So I don't believe a moratorium has ever been tried at the state level, but certainly given the inability of us at this point to pass any sort of just even reasonable regulation of CAFOs, I doubt that a full-on moratorium would pass now. But that's not to say that if this issue gains traction and public awareness and people start demanding change from their legislators, that can't be something that we talk about.
And one thing that we have seen over time is that there's a growing diversity of people who are willing to speak up for stronger safeguards from these factory farms and willing to testify in the General Assembly about it. We had an interesting question from Kate about if there are any groups who are advocating for CAFO reform based on the conservative principle of protecting property rights.
Yes.
And say she was just blown away by how much property values were hit in the movie, and also as we've seen here in Indiana.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Kate, first you should know that we at the Hoosier Environmental Council and our partners and allies over the last several years have been largely focused on defeating bad ag bills. So that's a hopeful sign that we've been able to stop there was a bill that aimed at stripping local control. There was a bill or a resolution that would have amended Indiana's Right to Farm Act, Indiana's Constitution to create a constitutional fundamental right to farm. We were able to defeat that. But over the last 2 years, we were pushing for some moderate strengthening of our state agencies' ability to regulate factory farms, and specifically to control their air emissions that we know are emitted. And the arguments that we made in support of that bill were based on property rights arguments in addition to public health issues. Those arguments unfortunately didn't carry the day, although the bill did have bipartisan support, and I think property rights was really the most one of the most strong issues that resonated in the Indiana state legislature. So we are going to be exploring that as we move forward to see if maybe that sort of a bill might gain more traction.
Thanks, Kim. We are appreciating the questions that you all are putting into the chat box, and please continue to do so because we definitely want to hear what's on your mind, particularly as the memory of the film is very fresh. One of the questions that was asked by Jennifer was regarding property rights. Would you talk about the difference between citing setbacks of structure to structure versus building setbacks from property lines? That's an excellent point.
Yeah, that is a very good question, and something that a lot of people don't realize. Under our confined feeding law, there's a residential setback of 400 feet, and that's from structure to structure. So that's from the CAFO to the home, not from 400 feet from the property line. So in effect, if your home is 100 feet from the property line, the CAFO can be 300 feet I'm sorry, if I said that backwards. If your home is 300 feet from your property line, the CAFO can be 100 feet from its property line and essentially use your 300 feet as an easement. And another issue, another problem attendant to that is that under Indiana's confined feeding law, there is no maximum on the number of animals that can be at a CAFO. So that 400-foot setback applies whether it's a 2,500 hog operation or a 20,000 hog operation. The setback is going to be the same.
Thanks, Kim. You know, the energy from the questions that we're getting clearly is a hunger to make change at the state level. But let's just talk for a moment, Kim, about local level successes, because as you pointed out, HEC and our allies have helped to defeat some pretty terrible bills that would have worsened the protections of people in rural Indiana, but we haven't had the political momentum yet to actually pass meaningful proactive legislation. However, there have been some really noteworthy local victories, and maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. A few years back, there was a 5,000 head hog CAFO that was proposed just outside of Valparaiso, Indiana, up in Northwest Indiana, and the community rallied together, organized in a very forceful way, weighed in with their local officials, the plan commission that was considering the zoning issue that was before them, and ultimately that community with HEC's, with our help, defeated that CAFO. In Delaware County, same thing, the community was outraged and organized effectively, was able to stop a 10,000 hog CAFO from coming in. In addition, that community was able to reform its zoning ordinance to place more protective restrictions on new CAFOs that would be proposed. So it's possible, but it takes everybody getting involved.
And kind of related to that, Kim, tell us about your own, you've been, I've often said that of all issues that we get contacted on, we probably get contacted more on factory farm related issues than anything. Tell us about kind of the outreach you've gotten from communities and what that's led you and our organization to do.
Sure. We get contacted on a routine basis from either citizens who are suffering from factory farms or community groups wanting to stop a newly proposed factory farm. And we obviously can't help everybody because we're a mean and lean organization, but there's a lot of need and not a lot of HEC. So what we have been doing is community workshops throughout the state that teaches people what their legal rights are under our federal, state, and local laws, helps them understand the zoning process that applies in their communities, and essentially gives them the tools that they need to fight on their own. In certain cases where we think there's a legal path forward, we'll get involved in litigation, in bringing legal cases to either challenge zoning decisions that we believe are non-compliant with the law, or other legal avenues.
Great. Appreciate that. We're gonna try to wrap up here by 9 o'clock so that in the spirit of enabling folks to watch the presidential debate if they wanted to, and also in the spirit of just really acknowledging just how significant this election is. So please continue to ask questions, and I'll do my best to share them with Kim. Kim, so we've talked now about local level activities, some real signs of hope, some progress, some terribly cited CAFOs that have not moved forward, efforts on the part of communities to organize better in the face of new or expanded CAFOs. Let's go back to talking about the General Assembly. Tell us a little bit more about the reform bill that we tried to advance over a couple of sessions.
Yes, this was remarkably supported by bipartisan legislators, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, who co-authored and supported the bill. And what it would have done is it would have given our state agency, IDEM, the authority to say no to a permit, which unbelievably it does not now. And to be concrete about that, when the rule went into effect in 2011, since that time, IDEM has denied 0 confined feeding operation permits. So they're essentially a rubber stamp. So it would have given the agency the authority to say no if a CAFO would threaten public health of the environment. It also would have placed air emission restrictions on emissions that we know come from CAFOs, and it would have included reasonable setbacks so that existing homes wouldn't be impacted by noxious odors and emissions, among other things. One other important one was to eliminate this crazy provision under the current law that allows CAFOs to be built in real sensitive areas like karst terrain and areas with high water tables. So it would have eliminated that as well. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just add one more thing, Jesse. The hope, there is some hope there with that. We did get a committee hearing, which was a first ever for a CAFO reform bill, and it was a standing room only committee hearing. So this is something that people want. We've literally got to grow this movement and push for this sort of legislation, but it's going to take more than what HEC is doing now, and more than the people that are already involved. It's going to take everyone.
Yeah, let's kind of talk about that. And I think that will speak to a question that a couple of folks have asked in the Q&A, which is just this issue of movement building. Clearly, the people who are at the heart of advocacy are people who are hurting from it, whether it's their wells getting contaminated or their air getting contaminated, whereby they can't bring in their grandkids to visit because the odor is too strong. Let's talk about kind of that expanding movement. Public health voices have started to get involved as well. Tell us a little bit more about the new type of voices that have gotten involved, and maybe if you could share some ideas with our audience about what they can, who in their community they could seek out to as allies in this effort to eventually get state reform.
Right. Well, we know that tourism is impacted in Indiana when a CAFO moves in. It lowers property values, lakeside property values especially. We know that lake values go down when green algae blooms grow because of excess nutrients from factory farms. So, we have seen an interest by tourism groups, but we need to grow that. Certainly, public health. You mentioned real estate. Real estate appraisers, real estate brokers who are seeing their livelihoods being impacted because home sales plummeting when a factory farm moves in. And certainly civic leaders, folks who care about social justice and communities can step up to the plate. Folks who have connections to business leaders and green-minded business leaders in their communities that want to see local economic development thrive. Local economic development plummets when you've got the local businesses that would otherwise be there if it weren't for the stench of an industrial factory farm. So we want to grow those constituencies and get them more involved in speaking out on this issue.
One of the things that you drove home was just how consolidated this industry is. And one of the questioners asked about the fact that, when there is a media spotlight or maybe a documentary spotlight on some of these mega corporations that might be a big polluter, how is that reverberating in terms of, either the ability to get reform, or to how is it possibly affecting maybe people's attitudes towards meat? What is the tangible impact or outcome of this media scrutiny?
I'm really glad you asked that. This brings home the point that we don't have to wait for policy change. I mean, we have to fight for it. It's essential that we fight for it because people are suffering, but we can also make change in our own lives and choose not to buy the products that are produced from this industry. And we're seeing that movement grow. We're seeing the local sustainable foods movement grow. So that, I think, is a positive outcome of people hearing this message. I think, unfortunately, what we've seen in state houses, and certainly in the Indiana State House, is that there is so much control by this industry that we have got to do a better job of getting people to show up and talk to their individual legislators about this, because they're only hearing from the industry and they're not hearing from an overwhelming majority of their constituency, which is what is necessary to provide the counterbalance of this very well-funded, powerful industry.
You know, and I think it's worth underscoring again, as you that there have been Republicans and Democrats that have been willing to sponsor CAFO reform legislation. Could you speak a little bit, Kim, to what brought the Republican lawmakers on board?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one in particular in his community had a very high number of CAFOs and lots of folks suffering. He himself was one. So I think it was, you know, obviously his personal experience and knowing people in his community that moved him. The other lawmaker similarly heard from an overwhelming number of folks in his community out of concern for a CAFO that was there. So, you know, those are two examples where these lawmakers heard from their constituents, and that prompted them to take action. And so that has to happen in communities, in districts across our state, in order to move lawmakers away from supporting industrial factory farms.
And let's zero in on that issue, because you've really underscored how there needs to really be a massive public outcry in order for reform to happen, because the agribusiness lobby is very organized. It funds campaigns, it volunteers in campaigns, it takes lawmakers to visit kind of cleaned up CAFOs, so to speak. So there's an exceptionally well-organized effort on that end. Let's just get to the basics here, Kim. What would be the call to action you would make to our listeners who want to talk to their state representative and state senator? What would you ask them to tell their lawmakers?
Right. Well, it's real simple. I mean, at this point, it's to tell your lawmakers that you care about this issue and that you want to see them pass reasonable protections for our air and water from CAFO pollution. It's literally that simple. And you can't just do it once. And you need to show up to third house meetings, you know, call them, email them, write them, you know, tell your neighbors to do the same. It's got to be a consistent message and something that these lawmakers hear from broadly. So, but it's a simple message. Do something. This is important. You care about it. You want protections. You want them to take action. It doesn't have to be, there's no magic language to it. Oh, you're on mute, Jesse.
Sorry, wanted to keep the spotlight on you there, Kim. One of the things that we wanted to mention to our listeners is that the easiest way to find contact information for your state representative and state senator is bit.ly, B-I-T-L-Y, or Y-L, I should say. Well, once I had it right the first time, bitly.com/inlegis, INLEGIS, all caps. And that is the quickest way to find the contact information of your state representative and state senator. State representatives are elected every 2 years. So there's a chance there may be some movement in terms of who is your state representative. So please make an effort to contact them after the elections and try to set up a Zoom meeting with them to talk to them about this issue and others. There's just a couple more points that I think we want to relay in the last few minutes of our time together. And one was raised by Jennifer listening in. And she said to please talk about the fallacy that CAFOs equal economic development and success for rural communities.
Yeah, and that's a great point. What you often hear at these planning and zoning hearings on a new CAFO is how many jobs they'll bring in or how much economic development a CAFO will bring in. And I think the movie provided a great example of how that just isn't so, and the numbers don't bear it out. I mean, typically these are very low paying jobs. And because these are industrial farms that don't require farm workers, and the CAFO is vertically integrated with a large corporation that controls all pieces of, or all aspects of production. All of the local businesses that used to be in a farm community that would support local farmers are now gone. I call it the Walmartization of rural communities, and that's why you drive through these small farming towns and they just look desolate. So the idea that a CAFO is going to bring economic development when it's polluting the air and polluting the water, it just defies common sense. And again, it's not at all what we see happening on the ground.
Thank you, Kim. And we'll have to make that the final comment from Kim. Thank you so much, Kim, for all the knowledge you shared with us and all of your years of dedication to protect communities from CAFO pollution. I want to conclude by thanking once again Jenny Jenkins for all of her time and effort to make this event possible. I also want to thank concerned citizens in Bartholomew, Decatur, and Delaware counties who made a special effort to get out the word in their communities, as well as our friends at the Winding Waters and Hoosier chapter of the Sierra Club for their efforts as well to spread the word. We very much hope that you will be attending Green the State House on November 20th and 21st, which you can register at hecweb.org/GTS. Kim will be moderating a panel on factory farms on November the 21st, and included in that panel will be two regional and national experts, as well as a prominent Republican lawmaker who has been courageous in his support for reform and protecting these communities. Once again, we really want to thank you all for taking the time to watch this powerful film and being with us in the Q&A. Please be on the lookout for an email from us in which we'll be sharing a recording of this conversation, as well as some resources for you to stay involved and to help us eventually secure the goal of reform for the good of the health of Hoosiers, for the animals who are suffering, and for the communities that have been hurting for far too long. So once again, thank you so much. If you want to learn about some great resources in terms of assessing candidates in a way that doesn't reflect an endorsement, please go to hecweb.org/vote, and we have several resources for you there. Once again, thank you so much, and we wish you all good health for many, many months ahead.
Thank you, everyone.